What if everything we know about the start of human civilization is just a fragment, a middle chapter of a story far older than we imagined? What if history didn't begin in Mesopotamia or Egypt, but hundreds of thousands of years before the first city was ever built? Hello and welcome. If you love unraveling history's deepest mysteries, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode. Comment below where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. Let's see just how far across time zones and continents our curiosity reaches. And if this video sparks your imagination, share it with someone who would be just as intrigued. Together, we're about to dive into a question that challenges everything we thought we knew. Close your eyes and imagine the world beneath your feet, not the cities or roads, not the power lines or the internet cables, but something deeper, beneath the concrete, beneath the stone, beneath the very idea of civilization. There is a silence. It is a silence so vast, so unbroken. It feels eternal. This is where the story begins, not with the first king, not with the first brick, but with what came before memory itself, history. As we are taught, begins with clarity. The moment we learn to shape stone and metal, to write names in clay, to raise temples toward the heavens. It begins with Mesopotamia, with Egypt, with the towering pyramids and the epic of kings and conquests. But what if that clarity is an illusion? What if our story begins not 5,000 or 10,000 years ago, but 100,000 years earlier? This is not a romantic idea. It is not the fantasy of lost worlds or fables dressed in stone. It is a reckoning with the arithmetic of time. Homo sapiens, us, have existed for at least 300,000 years. That is not theory. It is fact, grounded in bones, in genomes, in the dust and ash of ancient fires. Yet all the history we know, all the temples and tablets and tales that fill our libraries, account for just the last 5% of our time on Earth. The remaining 95% is mostly darkness, a silence where there should be memory, an abyss where stories should be. What happened in those forgotten epochs? What knowledge was gained? What was lost? And why have we remembered so little? We assume that because the evidence is scarce, nothing of consequence existed before the first city walls. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It may only be a reminder of how little survives the passing of ages. Think of how we know history. By what endures, a stone building in dry climate may last thousands of years. A text baked in clay can lie buried in sand and still speak, but wood rots, skin decays, bone crumbles, cloth disintegrates, and time is not gentle. The earth shifts, glaciers carve, floods rise, and winds grind even mountains into dust. What chance, then, does memory have, when written not in stone but in story or breath? Imagine if all of modern civilization were to end tomorrow. In one sudden collapse, humanity vanishes. In 1,000 years, our buildings will crumble. In 10,000, our books will be dust. In 100,000 years, even the pyramids may be mounds of stone swallowed by sand and soil. Our satellites will fall, our data will fade, and the monuments of our greatest triumphs will blur into the landscape. If future beings walked the earth then, what would they find? Perhaps a shard of glass, a twisted remnant of metal oxidized into red dust. Perhaps nothing. Would they believe we ever existed, or would they imagine the 21st century was still to come? This is not hypothetical. It is a mirror. What we lose in a few centuries, nature forgets in millennia. The deeper we dig into the earth, the fewer fragments we find. And so we tell ourselves a story of simplicity, that our ancestors were brutes in caves, aimless wanderers with fire and flint, waiting for the spark of civilization. But what if that story is only what survived? What if they built and dreamed and lost, and the traces were carried away by rain, buried under oceans, or ground beneath the weight of glaciers? What if the first cities are not the first, but merely the last we can still see? The way we excavate history betrays our bias. We dig in dry river valleys, in open plains, in deserts where time is kind to artifacts, but we do not search where history might truly sleep, under the sea, under the ice, under lands buried by floods and forgotten by maps. Our questions are shaped by what we already believe, and what we believe is that history began with the plough, the brick, and the written word. But memory does not begin with writing. It begins with meaning, with the first time someone looked at the sky and asked, why? With the first story told around fire, the first song, the first grief, the first dream. These are not things that fossilize, but they are the beginning of what it means to be human. Our ancestors had brains like ours, the same capacity for language, for reason, for art. They crossed continents, survived ice and drought, and adapted to worlds we cannot imagine. Why do we assume they spent hundreds of thousands of years doing nothing more than surviving? If we, in just a few thousand years, went from planting seeds to splitting atoms, what could they have done in 100,000? Perhaps they too built wonders. Perhaps they too mapped the stars or carved meaning into stone. Perhaps they remembered things we have long since forgotten. Or perhaps their greatest works were not monuments, but ways of life, systems of knowledge so deeply entwined with the land and the seasons that when the people died or moved on, nothing remained to speak their names. This is not proof. This is possibility. But possibility is not fantasy. It is the beginning of inquiry, the beginning of humility. And that is where this journey begins, not with a declaration, but with a question. What if the first civilizations came and went before the earth was ready to preserve them? What if we are not the first to wonder who came before? What if we are not at the beginning of the human story, but in the middle, standing on the ruins of forgotten chapters, blind to the depth of time stretching behind us? The earth does not speak easily, but it remembers, and if we listen to its silence, if we learn to read the gaps and shadows as carefully as the texts and stones, then maybe, just maybe, we will begin to see the outlines of a history far older than we dared to imagine. Our species, Homo sapiens, has walked the earth for at least 300,000 years. That is not a poetic exaggeration. It is a truth carved into bone, traced through the ancient code of our DNA, confirmed by skulls unearthed in the heat-cracked stones of Africa. And yet, for 95% of that time, there is silence. Not silence in life, but silence in what remains, the silence of memory lost, of knowledge erased, of generations lived and forgotten before writing had the chance to anchor thought in physical form. The question that lingers, growing louder the longer we stare into that silence, is this: if our ancestors were like us physically, mentally, emotionally, then what were they doing during those long, forgotten centuries? The fossil record tells a more complex story than the textbooks once suggested. In Jebel Irhoud, Morocco, archaeologists discovered the remains of Homo sapiens dated to 300,000 years ago. These were not some halfway species, not Neanderthals or earlier hominids. These were anatomically modern humans. Their skulls were shaped like ours, their brains just as large. They walked upright. Their hands were dexterous enough to shape tools, to paint, to gesture, to write if only they had the means. This was not a species still forming. This was us. And if they had the same neurological hardware, then why do we assume they lacked the software language, culture, curiosity? We assume the ancient world was simple because so little of it has survived. But survival is not a measure of significance. Consider the finds in Blombos Cave, South Africa. 75,000 years ago, humans, they carved deliberate crosshatch patterns into ochre stones, symbols that meant something. They wore beads made from shells, strung together with care. Jewelry is not a survival tool. It is not something you waste time on when the only goal is to live another day. It is a declaration: I am here, I belong, I see beauty, I mark meaning. This is not the behavior of mindless creatures. This is us, long before we thought civilization had begun. Go further back still, to Ethiopia, to the site of Herto. There, 160,000 years ago, humans deliberately buried their dead. They cleaned the skulls, perhaps polished them. They performed rituals, not for utility, not for food, but for memory, for mourning, for mystery. A people that buries its dead with care is a people that believes in something beyond the physical, a people with culture, with a story about life and death and what comes after. And in the Omo Valley, remains nearly 200,000 years old show humans who lived in organized groups, who hunted and traveled together, who survived through cooperation and planning. This is not random survival. This is community. The capacity for symbolic thought, the ability to let one thing stand for another, is the root of every human achievement. Language is a symbol. Art is a symbol. Mathematics, music, even myth. These are the tools of a mind that reaches beyond the immediate moment, that imagines and remembers and hopes. Our ancestors had this capacity tens of thousands of years before anyone built a city. They carved, they painted, they buried their dead, they adorned their bodies, they organized. They were already human in every sense that matters. So why is the record so empty? Why does it seem, on the surface, as if nothing happened until around 10,000 years ago? The answer may be cruel in its simplicity, because memory is fragile, because time erases, because transmission is harder than creation. It is one thing to learn, it is another to teach. For knowledge to survive, it must pass from one generation to the next, intact enough to be understood. Break that chain through catastrophe, through disease, through the migration of a people scattered from their homeland, and knowledge can vanish in a single lifetime. History is filled with examples. The Romans knew how to make concrete that hardened underwater. That recipe was lost for over 1,000 years. Medieval Europe forgot the philosophy of the Greeks until it returned through Arabic scholars. Indigenous communities have lost languages, techniques, and medicinal knowledge within a generation, simply because elders died without passing them on. We do not always retain what we know, we forget. And if we can forget so much in a single century, what could be lost in 10,000 years, or 100,000? We imagine that history builds in a straight line, that progress is inevitable, but that is a comforting myth. Progress is conditional. It depends on memory. It depends on stability. It depends on conditions so precise that even a small disruption, famine, war, climate change can unravel centuries of learning. Our ancestors may have built systems of thought we cannot imagine. They may have mapped the stars. They may have known plants and medicines, patterns in nature, truths about the world that have vanished as completely as if they had never been known at all. This is not speculation without evidence. It is speculation born from the fragments we do have: the ochre carvings, the buried skulls, the beads, the tools shaped with intention. These are not the relics of brutes. They are the echoes of minds like ours. The question we must ask is not, did they build civilization, but rather, what did they build that time did not preserve? We think writing is the beginning of history. But what if history began when we learned to remember? When the first person said, "Let me tell you a story," and someone else listened? If that is true, then the deep past, the 95% we call prehistory, is not empty. It is full. Full of lives, full of voices, full of knowledge. We simply no longer know how to hear them. The silence we see is not proof that nothing happened. It is proof only that time is a ruthless editor. And what it erased may have once been vast. If we are to ask what human beings were doing for the hundreds of thousands of years before cities, we must also ask what happened to the evidence of their lives. The deeper we go into the past, the less we find, not because nothing existed, but because time itself conspires against memory. The earth is not a museum. It is not a gentle curator of history. It is alive, in motion, reshaping itself constantly, covering, crushing, and drowning all but the most stubborn traces of what once was. This is not the fault of nature. It is simply what the planet does, and it is why the deeper history becomes, the more likely it is to disappear. Ice is a force of erasure. During the last 300,000 years, our planet has experienced multiple glacial cycles. These are not small changes in weather. They are world-altering events. When ice ages come, they come with walls of frozen mass stretching for thousands of kilometers. They drag across the land, kilometers thick, grinding forests, hills, and any human settlements beneath them into oblivion. During the height of the last ice age, ice sheets blanketed what is now Canada, Scandinavia, Northern Europe, and vast parts of Asia. Any evidence of human life in those regions, if it existed, was likely scraped away, pulverized to silt, or buried beneath layers of compacted glacial debris. Where the ice does not reach, the water does. Ice locks up water in frozen storage. Sea levels fall. Coastlines stretch outward. What was once ocean becomes fertile plain. And, as humans always do, we follow the water. We settle near rivers, on coastlines, where life is richest. But when the glaciers melt, as they always do, the water returns. It floods the plains, swallows the coasts, turns forests into seafloors. During the last glacial maximum, sea levels were over 120 meters lower than today. That is the height of a 40-story building. Now imagine that much ocean covering the land where early humans may have built homes, shared knowledge, or gathered in community. All of it drowned. All of it buried beneath sediment, invisible to the eye. Doggerland is one of the clearest examples of this great forgetting. Today, the North Sea lies between Britain and mainland Europe, cold, deep, and seemingly eternal. But 12,000 years ago, it was land, a rolling plain of rivers, forests, and game. Archaeological evidence shows that people lived there, hunter-gatherers who made tools, hunted animals, perhaps even built shelters. But when the sea rose, Doggerland disappeared. It did not vanish all at once. It was a slow retreat. First marsh, then islands, then silence. Now, only fishing trawlers dredging the seafloor find traces, a flint blade, a fragment of bone. The tusk of a mammoth, enough to whisper that life was once there, but not enough to tell its full story. And Doggerland is not alone. To the southeast, the Sunda Shelf, now mostly underwater, once connected mainland Southeast Asia to the islands of Indonesia. It was a landmass larger than India, home to forests, rivers, and almost certainly human life. As the seas rose, Sunda became islands Java, Sumatra, Borneo separated by channels where there had once been forests and lakes. The same happened in the Persian Gulf, once a fertile river valley fed by the Tigris and Euphrates. Now, it is a shallow bay. Whatever settlements may have existed there were drowned. Their remains buried beneath layers of silt. This pattern repeats again and again across the globe. Land becomes sea. Valleys become gulfs. Fertile plains become continental shelves. And with every transformation, history vanishes. We look for early human settlements on land because that is what we can reach. But land is not where people always lived. The richest places for life estuaries, coastlines, river mouths are now underwater. If early civilizations arose in those places, as they likely did, then their remains are lost, not because they never existed, but because the ocean has hidden them. Even without ice or ocean, time alone can be a brutal eraser. Earthquakes reshape landscapes. Volcanoes bury cities. Wind scours inscriptions. Trees crack stone. Insects eat parchment. Fire turns wood to ash. 1,000 years is enough to erase most signs of human presence. 10,000 years, it is as if we were never there. Unless something is built of massive stone and protected from erosion, it does not last, and even stone, in time, breaks down. 100,000 winters will reduce even a pyramid to dust. We often marvel that the pyramids have lasted as long as they have, but they are the exception. Most human structures, even great ones, do not survive the slow, relentless processes of nature. Our modern buildings, made of concrete and steel, would not fare any better. Given 10,000 years without maintenance, our cities would collapse. Forests would reclaim them, and the shifting earth would cover the rest. In 100,000 years, the only clues left of our existence might be a few strange isotopes, scattered microplastics, and odd mineral concentrations deep in the sediment. And so we must ask, if our own civilization could disappear so thoroughly, why do we expect to find obvious traces of those that may have come before? Why are we so certain that nothing happened in the vastness of the past, when the mechanisms of forgetting are everywhere? The history we know is a history of luck, luck that someone built in stone, luck that they buried their dead in the right soil, luck that the climate was dry enough to preserve a scroll. Without that luck, memory fades, and with enough time, even the greatest achievements can vanish. This is the great forgetting. It is not a single catastrophe. It is not a sudden loss. It is the slow, quiet work of Earth itself, and it has been erasing for hundreds of thousands of years. Ice grinds, water drowns, sediment buries, vegetation swallows. The planet does not keep history for us. It resets. it starts again. And whatever was, whatever might have been, is gone unless we learn to look differently, to ask harder questions, and to search not for what has survived, but for the shadows of what was lost. For over a century, archaeology has told a story shaped by geography as much as by evidence. We excavate where it's easiest on dry land, in deserts, on plains, in places where the climate has done us the favour of preserving the past. But this creates a silent bias. It suggests that the story of human civilization unfolded where we happen to be looking. We study Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and Mesoamerica, not because they are the only places where people once lived, but because they left behind ruins in places still accessible to us. Yet for most of human history, the places where people thrived have since vanished beneath the sea. Imagine a map of the world during the last ice age. Sea levels were 120 meters lower. The coastlines stretched farther out. Entire continents were larger. Islands we know today were once part of broader land masses. The areas now underwater continental shelves, sunken river valleys, drowned coastlines total more than 20 million square kilometers. That's roughly the size of North America. Fertile, livable land, lost not through war or disaster, but through the slow rising breath of the planet as the ice melted. These were not barren wastelands. They were prime real estate rivers, forests, gentle shores, the very places our ancestors would have built their homes. And yet, almost all archaeological effort has been focused on what remains above water, not because the underwater regions are unimportant, but because they are difficult. Underwater archaeology is expensive, slow, and often yields little. Visibility is low, sediments shift, artifacts are buried under meters of silt. Sonar gives us hints, not answers. Divers can reach only shallow depths. Submersibles are rare and costly. Most of the ocean floor has never even been mapped in high resolution, let alone searched for ruins. We are trying to reconstruct a puzzle, but we are ignoring most of the table. Take the Gulf of Cambay off the western coast of India. In the early 2000s, marine scientists conducting sonar surveys for pollution research found something unexpected: long, straight lines, right angles, patterns that resembled man-made structures lying 30 to 40 meters below the current sea level. Intrigued, they retrieved samples, worked stone, pottery fragments, even carbon-dated wood, suggesting ages between 7,000 and 9,000 years. That's older than the Indus Valley civilization. If the interpretations are correct, it could represent a city or many that existed before any known Indian culture. But the findings remain contested. The waters are murky, and sustained excavation is nearly impossible. No definitive proof has yet emerged. Still, the possibility remains. Floating just beneath the waves, off the coast of Japan, lies the Yonaguni Monument. Discovered in 1986 by a diver exploring the seabed near the Ryukyu Islands, the structure is massive terraced. Angular, almost pyramidal, it features flat surfaces, right angles, what some claim to be steps, platforms, and even a path that winds upward like a ceremonial road. The stone is natural sandstone, and skeptics argue it was shaped by tectonic activity and erosion, but others believe it was modified, if not entirely carved, by human hands. If artificial, it would have been created before the area was submerged at least 10,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. Like many such mysteries, the debate continues unresolved. Cuba's underwater anomalies tell a similar story. In the deep waters of the Yucatan Channel, sonar surveys in the late 1990s revealed symmetrical patterns on the ocean floor, geometric shapes and structures that, if verified, would be impossibly ancient. But visibility is nearly zero. No detailed exploration has followed. The evidence remains tantalizing, but incomplete, a pattern we see again and again. Even in the Mediterranean, entire known cities have sunk. Pavlopetri, a Bronze Age settlement off the coast of Greece, lies submerged but intact, complete with roads, buildings, and tombs under just 4 meters of water, and these are from the recent past. If whole cities from a few thousand years ago can sink and nearly be forgotten, what hope is there for structures from 30,000 or 50,000 years ago? And yet, we search. Because the logic is undeniable. Humans live near water. We always have. It provides food, transportation, and fertile land. Coastlines and river mouths are where civilizations are most likely to begin. And those ancient coastlines, those real cradles of early humanity, are now under hundreds of feet of ocean. This forces us to reconsider not just where we look, but how we interpret what we find. Because the sites we consider ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, China may not be the true beginnings. They may be the survivors. The ones that happened to be built in places that did not drown. The ones that lasted just long enough to leave evidence we could find. They may be echoes of older stories that vanished without leaving a trace. We must also remember that what we find is not necessarily representative. Göbekli Tepe and Jericho are wonders not because they are the first of their kind, but because they remain. There may have been others, dozens, hundreds equally or more advanced, now lost beneath the sea or turned to dust beneath glaciers. Our timeline is not linear. It is selective, shaped by preservation, by chance, by the shifting layers of Earth. We must accept that our knowledge of prehistory is constrained not by human failure, but by geological indifference. The Earth keeps no special reverence for memory. It buries everything. It forgets. And when we look at the gaps in the record, we must stop thinking of them as empty. They are not voids. They are volumes, pages written and then torn away. Pages we may never recover. But this changes the nature of our search. We are no longer looking for isolated brilliance, the first city, the first monument, the first tool. We are listening for a pattern, a whisper beneath the waves, a trace in the silt, a symbol carved too deep to erode. We must go where the evidence is hardest to find, into the drowned coasts, the buried valleys, the places no one thought to look. Only then might we begin to see the truth, that the story of civilization did not begin where we thought. It began where the sea now lies. And we, for all our tools and knowledge, have only begun to uncover the edges of what came before. While the ocean may have swallowed much of our early past, not everything was built on low ground. Some traces of what might have come before survived simply because they were elevated high above the coastlines that later vanished, in places less prone to flooding and erosion. These are the rare fragments that escape the sea's reach, preserved by altitude, not necessarily by intent. And when we look at these sites, when we truly examine them without the assumptions of linear progress, we find a pattern both thrilling and troubling. Complex architecture and symbolic culture appearing earlier than our historical models predicted, as if these achievements had not been invented on the spot, but remembered. Start with Göbekli Tepe. in the dry highlands of southeastern Turkey. For centuries, the hill beneath which it lay seemed unremarkable. But in the 1,990 seconds, archaeologists began uncovering something that rewrote our understanding of early humanity. Beneath the soil were massive stone pillars, some weighing 20 tons or more, arranged in great circular formations. The carvings on them were intricate foxes, scorpions, lions, birds clearly symbolic, clearly meaningful. These were not mere markers, they were monuments, structures that required planning, coordination, and extraordinary labour to build. But here is what makes Göbekli Tepe so important. It predates agriculture. It predates cities. It even predates pottery. The site is at least 11,600 years old, built by people we still classify as hunter-gatherers. By all conventional logic, these people should not have had the time, resources, or social organization to erect something so monumental. And yet, they did, which means the conventional logic might be wrong. Perhaps the ability to build came first, and agriculture followed as a response to the need to support large, organized communities. Perhaps what we see at Göbekli Tepe is not the beginning of building, but the survival of a tradition far older passed down, preserved, and finally expressed on a hill that happened to be high enough to endure. Jericho, too, challenges the sequence we've been taught. Nestled near the Jordan River, it is one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements on Earth. Excavations reveal stone walls, defensive towers, and organized urban life as early as 9,400 BCE. These were not temporary encampments. This was a place meant to last, and like Göbekli Tepe, it seems to emerge fully formed. There is no clear progression from simple shelters to complex urban architecture. The knowledge appears as if already in hand, as if learned elsewhere, then brought to a new place and applied again. Çatalhöyük, in central Turkey, offers another glimpse of early sophistication, dated to around 7500 BCE. It was a dense, urban settlement housing thousands of people. Its homes were built side by side, with entrances through the roofs. Inside, walls were decorated with murals and reliefs. Shrines were common. Burials occurred beneath the floors. This was not a loose gathering of nomads. It was a structured community with art, ritual, and spatial planning. And again, it shows little evidence of gradual evolution. The architecture is intentional. The city plan is coherent. The people who lived there were not discovering civilization, they were practicing it. Across the world, in the dry valleys of Peru, lies Caral, one of the oldest known cities in the Americas. It rose around 3000 BCE, yet it already had pyramids, plazas, and evidence of organized ceremonial life. Trade goods found at the site suggest long-distance connections, possibly with coastal and inland communities. But again, what is missing is the slow build-up. Caral appears as a leap, not a crawl, as if the idea of the city was already formed before the first stone was laid. These sites are anomalies only because our model of history is rigid. We expect to see progress as a smooth arc, nomads to villages, villages to towns, towns to cities. But what we find are sudden blooms of complexity, architecture appearing in full strength without a visible seed. These are not isolated genius moments. They are signs of inheritance, knowledge that survived somewhere, perhaps in oral traditions, perhaps in smaller groups, and re-emerged when conditions allowed. This pattern is reinforced by the rock art found throughout southern Africa. In caves and on cliff faces, humans drew geometric shapes, animals, and symbolic figures as far back as 75,000 years ago. These were not random etchings. They were deliberate, repeated patterns suggesting a shared language of meaning. The people who made them were not just surviving, they were recording, expressing, remembering, and their art connects them through time. To those who carved the pillars of Göbekli Tepe and painted the walls of Çatalhöyük in Australia, Aboriginal rock art traditions stretch back at least 40,000 years. Some of these visual records remain active in cultural use today, meaning that stories told now are linked to ancestors who lived millennia ago. This is not theoretical continuity. It is living memory. A culture that has endured through oral tradition for longer than most of our written civilizations have even existed. If that kind of memory can last 40 millennia, what else might have been preserved, or could have been preserved? Had the land and climate cooperated? The timeline keeps pushing backward, not because of speculation, but because of evidence. Every new discovery moves the boundary of civilization further into the past. But these sites appear like islands complex, isolated, and without clear predecessors. It's as if we are seeing the ruins of something older, fragments of a larger pattern we cannot fully perceive. Perhaps these were not the first to build. Perhaps they were the ones lucky enough to build where their work could survive. It is tempting to see sites like Göbekli Tepe or Karal as the first sparks of civilization, but perhaps they are only the embers of a fire that once burned brighter and wider than we can now imagine a fire lit by peoples whose names are lost, whose knowledge slipped beneath the waves or crumbled beneath glaciers. And now, on scattered high grounds, we find their echoes, their monuments, their memories carved in stone, not the beginning, but the reminder that something came before. To understand the minds of our ancestors, we don't need to find temples or cities. Sometimes, a single object, a tool shaped by hand, a flake chipped with precision, can whisper across the abyss of time. It can reveal thought, intention, even abstract reasoning. These artifacts may seem small, but they are the fingerprints of cognition, the evidence that the people who held them were not simply surviving, but thinking. And some of the tools we've found tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years old, reveal a level of sophistication that challenges our assumptions about when complex intelligence truly emerged. One of the most striking examples is the Levallois technique, a method of stone tool production used as far back as 300,000 years ago. Unlike random flaking, this approach required planning. The toolmaker would first shape a core, preparing it so that a single, controlled strike could remove a flake of a specific size and shape. This wasn't guesswork. It was geometry. It was foresight. It was mental modeling, visualizing a result, and then executing the steps to achieve it. This is what engineers do. This is what architects do. That our ancestors practiced this kind of reasoning so long ago forces us to reconsider how early abstract thought truly began. The Levallois technique wasn't isolated to a single region. It appears in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, across various populations. This suggests that knowledge was either independently discovered multiple times, which itself implies a high baseline of cognitive ability, or it was shared, passed from group to group, preserved through oral instruction. Both possibilities point to a deeper layer of human experience than we typically acknowledge for the distant past. And these tools weren't simple knives or scrapers. Some were hafted attached to wooden shafts using natural adhesives like resins or animal glue. That means our ancestors understood chemistry, at least intuitively. They experimented. They observed that certain substances hardened when dried or became sticky when heated. This is not rote survival. This is scientific thinking. It is curiosity turned into technique. It is trial, error, and refinement. In South Africa's Sibudu cave, archaeologists have found evidence of compound adhesives used over 70,000 years ago. The tool makers mixed plant gum with ochre and heated the mixture to create a more effective glue. Getting the ratio right required skill. Too much ochre, and the mixture would be brittle. Too little, and it wouldn't hold. This was not accidental. It was learned, taught, and improved over generations. Even earlier, around 160,000 years ago at Pinnacle Point, our ancestors were heat-treating stone. They discovered that by placing certain rocks in fire, then allowing them to cool slowly, they could make the stone easier to flake, producing sharper tools. This is thermally induced modification, an early form of materials engineering. It requires not just discovery, but memory, control of fire, and an understanding of how heat transforms matter. These are cognitive skills deeply rooted in observation and cause-effect logic. Elsewhere, bone tools appear with delicate barbs and grooves, likely used for fishing or sewing. These require fine motor skills and advanced planning. In some regions, we find tools with symmetrical designs, evidence that aesthetics and precision mattered. This is not survival at its simplest. It is survival enriched by culture, by standards, by knowledge systems that valued not just utility, but refinement. Even more telling is the consistency of tool types over wide areas. Similar designs appear across distances of hundreds or thousands of kilometers. This implies communication. It implies exchange, not just of objects, but of ideas. Our ancestors were not static. They moved. They met. They shared. Ideas flowed along the same paths as rivers and game migrations. Knowledge was portable, and it travelled with them. Yet despite all of this, we still tend to think of these early people as primitive. Why? Because we do not see the monuments. We do not see cities rising from stone. We assume complexity begins only when something massive appears in the landscape. But that assumption ignores the reality of how most human knowledge is preserved, not in towers or tablets, but in hands and habits. In the way someone naps a stone, in the way they pass down a skill, in the way a child learns to make a tool not through reading, but by watching, copying, and practicing. Civilization is not just built with bricks. It is built with memory. And memory is vulnerable. A community may carry a technique for generations, perfect it, depend on it, and then lose it, if the people who know it are scattered or killed or forced to flee. A drought, a flood, a war, or even a change in climate could erase a tradition that took millennia to form. The knowledge embedded in tools like those made with the Levallois technique might be the last visible remnant of a much broader understanding, one that included language, mythology, social structure, medicine, and perhaps even architecture, now lost to time. We must not mistake silence for simplicity. We must not assume that the absence of monumental ruins means the absence of civilization. In many ways, these early technologies, the adhesives, the controlled heating of stone, the barbed bone tools, the symmetrical blades are more telling than pyramids. They speak to continuity. They speak to a culture that valued transmission, precision, and improvement. They show us minds that were focused, skilled, and deliberate. And as we study these ancient tools, we must also consider what else might have existed alongside them. What languages were spoken to teach the next generation how to strike stone in just the right way? What stories were told as people sat around fires, carving and shaping? What systems of measurement, belief, or tradition guided their craft? These are questions we cannot yet answer, but they are questions we must begin to ask. Because every tool we find is a doorway, a glimpse into a mind that worked much like ours. And every time we hold such a tool in our hands, we are touching the thoughts of someone who lived 100,000 years ago and thought not as a beast, but as a builder. The past does not only live in ruins or tools, it lives in us, in every cell, every strand of DNA. Our bodies carry an archive older than any tablet, deeper than any tomb. When archaeologists dig through layers of soil, they find bones and artifacts. But when geneticists look inward, they find something far stranger, the echoes of entire peoples who no longer exist. They find ghosts, not spirits, but genetic traces of vanished lineages. And those ghosts tell a story of contact, migration, and memory far richer than the neat lines drawn in history books. For decades, we believed the story of Homo sapiens was relatively straightforward. We evolved in Africa, spread out into the world, and replaced earlier human species like Neanderthals and others who had wandered into Europe and Asia before us. But when scientists sequenced the Neanderthal genome in the early 21st century, everything changed. They found something shocking. Neanderthal DNA was not confined to ancient bones. It was inside us. Today, every non-African person carries between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. That means Homo sapiens and Neanderthals did not just encounter each other. They interbred. They lived together, shared lives, and had children. They weren't just enemies or strangers. They were, at times, family. This is not just a romantic image. It has consequences. Some of the genes inherited from Neanderthals influence our immune system, our skin, our metabolism. Others may be linked to neurological traits, even sleep patterns. These aren't just fossil memories. They are active parts of who we are. They show that knowledge, survival strategies, and biological adaptations could have been shared between distinct human populations. When we think of ancient humans meeting, we imagine conflict. But what if there was exchange of tools, stories, languages, insights? What if those meetings were moments of cultural fusion, not erasure, and the Neanderthals are only one ghost lineage? In a Siberian cave called Denisova, a single finger bone led to an even more astonishing discovery. The DNA extracted from that bone did not match Neanderthals or Homo sapiens. It belonged to a new kind of ancient human, the Denisovans. We know almost nothing about them. Their fossil record is tiny fragments of teeth, bits of bone, but their genetic impact is immense. Populations in Melanesia, Australia, and parts of East Asia carry significant Denisovan DNA, sometimes up to 5%. That suggests widespread interaction between Homo sapiens and Denisovans across thousands of miles and many generations. More intriguingly, some of the Denisovan genes appear to have conferred real advantages. One variant, common in Tibetan populations, helps the body adapt to high altitudes by improving oxygen absorption, an adaptation that likely came from Denisovan ancestors. In other words, ancient interbreeding may have directly shaped how we survive in specific environments even today. These were not random encounters. They had lasting impact. But not all ghost lineages are named. Geneticists have found signs of at least one unknown archaic human lineage in modern African genomes. This group, whatever it was, left no known fossils, no bones, no tools we can confidently attribute, but its DNA lives on. It contributed to the genetic makeup of many African populations, suggesting a long period of contact and interbreeding. Who were they? We may never know, but their genetic fingerprint is real, preserved inside people alive today. This blurs the idea of a single human lineage. We are not a straight line from primitive to modern. We are a braid, a convergence of branches that once ran separately. Our species is a blend of intelligence, adaptation, and inherited memory from cousins we once walked alongside. This complexity also opens the door to new questions. If these other human groups contributed genes, could they have contributed knowledge? Did Neanderthals pass along more than just immunity? Did Denisovans share observations about weather, stars, animals, plants? If people were able to pass on advantageous genes, were they also passing on stories? Language does not fossilize. Culture leaves no DNA. But if there was sustained contact between species, it is likely that information moved alongside biology. Skills, rituals, symbols. These are the intangible things that may have flowed between groups as freely as blood. The idea of ancient humans learning from one another is not speculation. It is what humans do. We imitate. We adapt. We teach. Even in prehistory, that pattern likely held. And what if there were more? Genetic studies continue to reveal unexplained fragments, genes that don't match any known group. These suggest the existence of additional ghost populations, peoples who lived, adapted, flourished, and then vanished without leaving behind stone monuments or buried cities. Their only legacy may be inside us, written in the spiral of our chromosomes, waiting for scientists to decipher the story. This perspective reshapes our understanding of deep time. We often imagine the ancient world as empty, sparse populations, isolated bands of humans wandering across untouched landscapes. But what if it was more like a network? What if different hominin groups coexisted, interacted, moved through one another's territories, and sometimes merged? Instead of a single story, we might be looking at a vast tapestry, woven from many threads now lost, with only the fibers still embedded in our genes. If a civilization had risen 100,000 years ago, and its physical traces were destroyed by glaciers or drowned by rising seas, how would we know? Perhaps the only clue would be biological. Perhaps the genes of its people still echo in us, not in ways we recognize yet, but in patterns of resilience, in strange genetic signatures that don't quite belong to any known group. That is the power of DNA. It remembers when everything else is forgotten. The bones of the earth may have crumbled, the ruins may be gone, but our blood still sings with ancient memory. We are not the first. We are not alone. We are the children of many people, some remembered, some erased, and through us they live on, long before writing, before scrolls or tablets or carved inscriptions. There was another vessel of memory, older, more fragile, yet often more enduring. It was the human voice, the story told by firelight, the tale passed from elder to child, the song carried across generations. We call these myths now, and for centuries We treated them as fiction, symbolic, poetic, but ultimately detached from reality. But what if we've misunderstood them? What if myth is not imagination but remembrance? What if the stories we inherited are distorted echoes of things that truly happened so ancient that only metaphor could preserve them? Take the flood. The story is nearly universal. Across continents and cultures, peoples recall a time when the waters rose and the world was submerged. In the ancient Near East, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim, who built a great boat to survive a God-sent deluge. In the Hebrew Bible, Noah does the same. In India, Manu is warned by a sacred fish and saves life from the rising tide. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha float on a chest as the world drowns. In Chinese myth, the world floods and is reshaped by Yu the Great. Aboriginal Australians, Pacific Islanders, Native Americans all have their versions. Scholars once explained this as psychological metaphor, the fear of nature, the longing for renewal. But then geology entered the conversation. We now know that around 12,000 years ago, the last ice age ended. Glaciers melted. Sea levels rose fast. Sometimes catastrophically, glacial lakes, held back by walls of ice, burst and sent walls of water crashing across entire regions. The Black Sea may have flooded suddenly through the Bosporus. Coastal plains vanished beneath the rising ocean. To the people who lived near those waters, it would have felt like the end of the world. And they would have remembered, not with calendars, not with scientific models, but with stories that became myths. And those myths carried forward for thousands of years, across continents, into the memory of cultures we now study in books. The fact that so many different societies share this same story suggests something more than coincidence. It suggests a common experience transmitted, changed, reinterpreted, but rooted in truth. Modern science has begun to confirm that oral traditions can preserve real information far longer than once believed. Aboriginal Australians tell of lands that once existed along the coast, of islands walked to that, are now submerged. These stories map precisely onto geological changes that occurred between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. That means some of these oral histories are accurate across a span of time, longer than any civilization has endured. They are not just myths, they are records. And if memory can last that long, what else might it remember? Many myths speak of golden ages, times before the present world, when people lived in harmony, possessed greater wisdom, knew things we have since forgotten. In Hindu tradition, these are the yugas, vast epochs of decline from a perfect beginning. The Greeks spoke of the age of Chronos, when people lived without labour or pain. The Hopi tell of earlier worlds, destroyed and remade. The Maya recorded previous suns, each ending in disaster. Even Plato's Atlantis, whatever its original purpose, describes a society advanced in knowledge and power, destroyed in a single night. To modern minds, these sound like fantasy. But again, the pattern is striking. Different cultures, separated by oceans and time, tell of a world that came before a world more advanced, more peaceful, more in tune with nature or the cosmos. Could it be that these are memories too, not of literal perfection, but of a civilization older than the ones we know, one that was lost in the upheavals that marked the end of the last ice age? Perhaps they are, perhaps not. But what's important is this. When we dismiss myth entirely, we risk throwing away our oldest source of memory. we risk ignoring the possibility that the past is deeper than our models suggest. Even the forms of these stories may carry meaning. When people say, knowledge came from the stars, we hear metaphor. But what if the stars were simply the heavens? What if teachers came from across the sea, from lands now drowned? What if the gods were survivors, bringing memory from a place that no longer exists, only to be mythologized over generations until they became divine? In Sumerian tradition, the Apkallu were sages from before the flood civilizers, teachers. In Mesoamerica, the god Quetzalcoatl brought agriculture, law, astronomy. In Polynesian lore, ancestral navigators arrived from distant islands long gone. In each case, the figure is not just a deity, but a bearer of knowledge. That knowledge, navigation, agriculture, construction is exactly what one might expect from someone carrying forward the legacy of a lost culture. Could these myths be fractured accounts of cultural transmission, the memory of contact between survivors of one world and the builders of the next? If so, they are not fantasy, they are history in its earliest form, preserved not in stone, but in story. We must learn to read myth the way we read sediment or DNA, not literally, but seriously. Each story is a data point, a narrative fossil, an echo, warped by time and language, of something that mattered enough to preserve for millennia. And when stories repeat across cultures, when floods drown the world, when golden ages vanish, when gods teach humans, we must consider the possibility that something real lies beneath the surface. Because myth is not just about the past, it's about survival. A society does not pass down a story for 10,000 years unless it serves a purpose, unless it preserves something too valuable to forget. These stories outlasted kingdoms, languages, even continents. They are the voices of ancestors speaking through metaphor, wrapped in symbol, surviving the fall of stone and the erasure of time. So the next time we hear a myth of a great flood, of a vanished land, of a teacher from the stars, we should not ask only, is it true? We should ask, what is it trying to remember? Because myth, like DNA, is a form of memory, and sometimes memory is all that remains. If myths are memories, then what else might they be preserving? Not just floods or warnings, but whole civilizations, entire vanished chapters of the human story that exist now only in tales we've dismissed as allegory. Myths speak not only of disasters, but of knowledge, of golden ages, of teachers, of lands now lost. The question is not whether every detail is literally true, but whether the structure of these stories encodes fragments of a forgotten world, one that may have been as real as anything we now remember. Let us begin with Atlantis, not because it is the only tale of its kind, but because it is the most infamous. Plato tells us that Atlantis was an island nation beyond the Pillars of Heracles. It was rich, powerful, organized, and advanced. But through corruption and pride, it fell out of favor with the gods and was destroyed in a single day and night. Scholars have long debated the purpose of the story. Some say Plato invented it as an allegory, a political warning about the decay of power, but the details he gives are unusually precise. The measurements of temples, the structure of the city, the timeline of its destruction, too detailed. Some argue for mere invention. And even if Plato's version is fictional, where did the idea originate? Across the world, stories echo Atlantis in startling ways. The Tamil people of South India speak of Kumari Kandam, a landmass south of India lost to the sea, where a flourishing civilization once existed. Polynesian traditions describe Hawaii, a spiritual homeland submerged in the ocean. Japanese folklore includes tales of a lost continent called Mu. Native American traditions tell of ancient people who came from lands across the water, long gone. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl arrives from the east, bringing knowledge from a drowned homeland. The names are different, the myths are different, but the theme is the same: a civilization that once existed, now gone, remembered only in fragments, passed down through stories too old to trace. Could all these cultures have invented the same idea separately? Perhaps. Or perhaps they are preserving the memory of coastal societies that flourished when sea levels were lower and perished when the oceans returned. We know the ocean rose. We know land was lost. It is not wild to think that cultures disappeared with it, and that survivors, displaced and scattered, carried their memories with them. Those survivors, in time, would be remembered not as people, but as something more: teachers, guides, gods. Myths often describe culture bringers, figures who arrive after catastrophe and restore order. In Sumerian myth, the 7 Apkallu emerge from the sea to rebuild civilization after the flood. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl brings the calendar, astronomy, and writing. In Egypt, Thoth teaches humans language and calculation. In India, the rishis transmit cosmic knowledge. These beings are always wise, always strange, and always come from somewhere else. They are also described as being fundamentally human in some ways. They walk, they speak, they teach. They are not unreachable deities, but intermediaries. Could they be mythologized versions of real people, holders of surviving knowledge from lost civilizations, deified by those who remembered them only through story? If we can forget technology in a few generations, imagine how memory reshapes identity over centuries. A skilled navigator might become a sky god. A teacher might become a god of writing. A healer, a god of medicine. The transition from memory to myth is a slow transformation, but it is one we see again and again. We call these tales superstition, but that judgment is recent. For most of human history, myth and memory were inseparable. They were not fake stories. They were the only way to preserve meaning. The brain encodes stories better than dates. Narratives outlast chronicles. And if myths lasted, it is because people believed they were important. That belief alone makes them worthy of study. And then there are the patterns. Mythologist Joseph Campbell spoke of archetypes repeating figures and themes that appear across cultures. The hero's journey, the trickster, the world tree, the sacred flood. He believed they came from the human psyche. But what if some of these patterns emerged because they were based on real events? The hero who descends into darkness and returns with knowledge, could that be a memory of survival, of escaping destruction and rebuilding? The lost golden age, could that be a cultural recollection of better times, before environmental collapse or migration? Science, too, has begun to entertain the possibility that myth can encode real geological and astronomical events. In Australia, some Aboriginal stories describe the impact of meteorites. In the Pacific, islanders tell of volcanoes erupting long before written records. In the Andes, myths speak of the sky, darkening a memory of ancient volcanic winters or comet impacts. If geological truth can hide in myth, why not historical truth? Perhaps the reason we have not connected these stories to archaeology is because we've been looking for literal confirmations. concentric rings in the sea, golden palaces. But memory doesn't preserve detail. It preserves feeling. A culture that lost its home in a flood will remember the water, the terror, the rebuilding. The coordinates may be lost, but the emotion survives. And over time, it becomes story. We may also have misunderstood the meaning of ancient symbols. We find spirals, circles, star maps, abstract patterns carved into stone, and assume they are decorative or ritualistic. But what if some are records? What if some encode knowledge, astronomy, mathematics, navigation preserved, not in writing, but in form? After all, the first writing systems began as pictograms. Perhaps there were others, symbolic systems that never became full alphabets, but still held meaning. Meaning that we have not yet learned to read. This does not mean every myth is history, but it does mean myth cannot be dismissed. It is a mirror, warped by time, but reflecting something real. If we can learn to interpret its distortions, we may uncover stories that reach deeper than any written text. We have dug into the ground for history. We have dived beneath the sea. But perhaps the oldest archive is in plain sight in the stories we told to survive. They are the echoes of voices that knew the sea was rising. They are the memories of people who saw the stars change, who fled lost lands, who rebuilt and taught and were remembered as gods, not because they were divine, but because they carried knowledge from a world that is now gone. When myths fade, when ruins collapse, when languages die, something still endures, something deeper, colder, more impartial than memory. The earth remembers, not in stories, not in symbols, but in sediment and stone. Beneath our feet, layered in ice and soil, lies the only archive that time cannot easily erase. It is not easy to read, and it does not speak in words, but if we learn its language of isotopes, of elemental ratios, of strange chemical anomalies, we may uncover evidence of human activity far older than we ever imagined, perhaps even of civilizations that rose and fell long before the ones we know. This idea, once considered fringe, has taken on new seriousness through what scientists now call the Silurian hypothesis. The name, drawn from science fiction, poses a provocative question. If an advanced civilization had existed millions of years ago, would we even know? Would there be any trace left after such vast stretches of time? The question doesn't assume that such a civilization existed. It simply asks what the evidence of one might look like. And the answer is unsettling. Almost nothing physical would survive. Not buildings, not roads, not even metal structures. Concrete crumbles, steel rusts, plastics, despite their reputation, break down under ultraviolet light and oxidation. Even stone monuments erode or become buried under geological layers. The pyramids, as mighty as they are, would vanish entirely if left untended for tens of thousands of years. Now imagine 100,000 or 1,000,000. Cities would be overtaken by forest, reduced to indistinct mounds. Rivers would change course. Mountains would rise and fall. The very skin of the planet would change. So what does survive? The planet's chemical signature. The deep layers of the Earth preserve information not in objects, but in elements. When we burn fossil fuels, we release carbon isotopes into the atmosphere. That change is measurable. Future geologists studying sediment cores, you will see a sudden spike in carbon 2 beginning in the 19th century. The unmistakable fingerprint of an industrial civilization Nuclear detonations leave behind radioactive isotopes plutonium-239, cesium-137, none of which occur naturally in these concentrations. These markers persist. They are the scars of technological life. Our use of synthetic chemicals, plastics, pesticides, pharmaceuticals leaves compounds that don't biodegrade. They seep into soil, accumulate in ocean sediments, and embed in the shells of marine creatures. Some persist for tens of thousands of years. Others may last far longer. Even mining operations leave geochemical footprints, unusual concentrations of metals, stripped seams of ore. These are the geological equivalents of graffiti, unnatural, deliberate, and distinct from normal Earth processes. So if we can alter the planet's chemistry, might someone before us have done the same? Could there be a chemical anomaly buried in ancient ice or rock that hints at forgotten intelligence? We haven't found such evidence yet, but perhaps we haven't looked carefully enough. Most geology assumes natural causes for anomalies, volcanoes, asteroid impacts, methane releases. But what if one spike in carbon was not a warming event, but an industrial one? What if a sudden layer of rare earth elements wasn't the result of a meteorite, but ancient mining? The deeper we drill into ice cores or ocean sediment, the fuzzier the record becomes. Layers compress, signals blur. The further back we go, the harder it is to distinguish human fingerprints from nature's random brushstrokes. But that doesn't mean the record is silent. It means we must ask better questions. It means we must be willing to see what we were never trained to look for. Consider this. Humans evolved over 300,000 years ago. Our capacity for abstract thought, for experimentation, for technological development has existed for that long. But our industrial civilization is only 200 years old. What if a previous culture had reached a similar threshold of complexity and then vanished? Not necessarily with skyscrapers or satellites, but with agriculture, metallurgy, energy systems, maybe even limited writing or proto-digital systems. Would any of it remain? It might, in traces. In anomalies, in the geological equivalent of a whispered rumour, not temples, but isotopes, not myths, but molecules. The Earth does not care what we build. It does not privilege modernity. It treats all human endeavour the same way as sediment, as strata. It buries, it compresses, it forgets. But in forgetting, it also records, it layers every change, every fire, every eruption, every invention, every extinction. In its silence, it is precise. This leads us to a new way of thinking about prehistory, not as an absence of knowledge, but as a different kind of archive, one that speaks not to the eye, but to instruments. One that will only yield its secrets if we change the questions we ask. Instead of, where are the cities, we must ask, where are the signatures, where are the isotopic curves that don't belong, the sudden shifts in trace elements, the chemical fingerprints that cannot be explained by volcanoes or comets or natural decay? We are just beginning to develop the tools to ask these questions. Our capacity to read ancient climate, to measure nanoscopic particles in sediment, to isolate rare isotopes, these are the keys to a different kind of history. A history without names, without battles, without kings or scribes. A history of presence, of impact. A history of interference in the natural cycles of the planet. If we someday find a spike of carbon-12 from 100,000 years ago, followed by a sudden return to baseline, what will we think? If we discover a layer of unusual metals or a cluster of synthetic compounds where none should be? Will we recognize it for what it might be, or will we dismiss it, as we have dismissed so many anomalies before? The point is not that there was an ancient advanced civilization. The point is that the Earth would not tell us easily if there had been. The clues would be small, scattered, hidden in the deep bones of the world. But they would be there, waiting, because the Earth does not lie. It simply forgets in layers, and sometimes, in the folds of those layers, a memory lingers, a trace, a question, something that doesn't fit, and when we find it, if we find it, we will not be at the end of the mystery. We will only be at the beginning, learning not to ask if civilization once rose and fell, but learning how to read the silence where it might have lived. We like to think of history as a straight path, a timeline stretching from primitive origins to modern brilliance, from fire to the wheel, to writing, to rockets. But this path, elegant as it appears, may be an illusion. What if history is not a line, but a wave? What if human civilization has not only risen once, but many times cresting and crashing like surf upon a shore, each new peak forgetting the one before it? If we accept the possibility that our past is older than we believe, then we must also accept that our sense of progress may be based on a misunderstanding of time itself. Look at a beach. Waves roll in, rise, break, and retreat. Each one seems to vanish, but it is not truly gone. It leaves behind traces, grains arranged differently, foam on the sand, the subtle reshaping of the shoreline. Civilization may function in the same way. It rises with knowledge, with cooperation, with creativity. Then it falls through disaster, through climate shifts, through slow unraveling. Then, slowly, it begins again, not from nothing, but from fragments, from stories, from tools, from half-remembered ideas passed forward like embers in the dark. Our own history offers examples. The collapse of Rome did not erase knowledge, but it buried it. Roads fell into disrepair. Cities emptied. Great libraries burned. For centuries, much of what had been built was lost. Literacy declined. Trade routes broke down. And yet, the knowledge was not gone forever. It re-emerged, preserved in monasteries, in Islamic centers of learning, in oral traditions and obscure texts. What had been forgotten was, eventually, remembered. The same pattern played out across other cultures. The Maya, whose cities once thrived with complex calendars, astronomy, and engineering, fell into decline. Their knowledge was not lost in a single moment, but faded across generations. Their descendants preserved fragments in art, in custom, in speech, but the great arc of their civilization broke, and it took centuries before we even began to understand what they had achieved. In India, in China, in Africa, empires rose and fell. Languages bloomed and vanished. Entire systems of medicine, philosophy, and mathematics developed independently, only to be lost when regimes changed or colonizers arrived. What we call the Dark Ages is not unique to Europe. Every culture has its interruptions. Every wave has its crash. Some waves are quiet, others thunder. Some leave ruins, others leave stories, but all return to the sea eventually. This does not mean we are doomed to forget everything, but it does mean that memory is not guaranteed. Progress is not permanent, and civilizations are far more fragile than we like to admit. A shift in climate, a pandemic, a war, a slow erosion of trust and infrastructure. These are enough to break the chain of memory. These are enough to bury cities. And yet, each time, something survives. A myth, a tool, a ruin, a gene, a pattern. And from these, the next wave builds. Perhaps that is why so many ancient structures seem to emerge fully formed. Perhaps they are not inventions, but revivals. Perhaps those who built Göbekli Tepe or Corral were not inventing civilization, but remembering it, drawing on knowledge passed down not through text, but through practice, through ritual, through inherited skill. It's possible that what we call prehistory is filled not with silence, but with repetition, rhythms of rise and fall that we've barely begun to chart. One civilization may have been lost to flood, another to fire, another to war, disease, or drought. And in each case, the survivors carried pieces of what came before. They passed them along as best they could, through stone, through symbol, through story. This is a humbling thought. It reframes us, not as the pinnacle, but as the latest, not as the first to dream, but the most recent in a long lineage of dreamers. Our skyscrapers, our satellites, our digital wonders, they feel permanent, but they are not. Without constant care, they decay. Without continuity, they vanish. If we disappeared today, how long before the earth buried us? How long before our cities were forests? Our machines were rust. Our knowledge was dust. The ocean of time is vast, and we are one wave upon it. But that does not make us meaningless. It makes us part of something larger, something cyclical, something human. Each wave leaves behind a trace for the next to find. Each crest remembers something the last one lost. And in that rhythm, there is a kind of immortality, not for individuals, but for ideas. We may never know for certain if there was a civilization before ours. The clues are too faint, the ocean of time too wide. But we can listen. We can look for the patterns. We can reframe the question, not are we alone in history, but what legacy are we leaving for the next wave? Will they find our stories, our echoes, our wisdom, or only our waste? Because the wave will retreat. That is inevitable. All civilizations fall. But if we are wise, we will pass something forward, not just technology, but humility. Not just monuments, but memory, so that when the tide comes again, the next builders will not begin in darkness. They will begin with light. History is not an arrow. It is a tide, and we, for all our brilliance, are part of the rhythm. To know that is not to despair, it is to belong. And perhaps that sense of belonging to a story longer than our lifetimes, older than our cities, is the most powerful knowledge we can carry. Because no matter how many waves crash, the ocean never ends. We often imagine ourselves at the start of something, the dawn of an era, the threshold of understanding. We tell ourselves that this moment, our moment, is the most advanced, the most important. But what if we are wrong? What if we are not standing at the beginning of human history, but somewhere in the middle, in the soft light of a sunrise that began long before we opened our eyes to see it? Think of a sunrise. The sun doesn't appear suddenly. Its light begins to spread while it is still hidden. The sky brightens. Shadows fade. Colors shift. By the time the sun breaks the horizon, the day has already begun. That is where we are stepping into light that has been rising for ages. The brilliance of modern civilization is real, but it may not be the first. It may be only the latest expression of something far older, a continuation of a story we did not begin. If human history truly began 100,000 years earlier than we think, then we must let go of the illusion that we are the origin point. We are not the source. We are the inheritors. Inheritors of a planet reshaped many times. Inheritors of memories told in myth, etched in stone, encoded in genes. We are standing on the shoulders of forgotten giants, those who dreamed, built, adapted, and vanished. This recognition demands humility. It asks us to see the past not as a ladder we climbed, but as a landscape shaped by tides of rise and fall. We are not the summit of human potential. We are a chapter in an ongoing saga. Our cities, our science, our achievements, these are not the first, and they will not be the last. One day they too will crumble, and perhaps, in a far future, someone will wonder what came before them. Perhaps they will find our traces, perhaps not, but this is not a cause for despair. It is a call to stewardship. If we are part of a longer continuum, then we have a role to play, not just in surviving, but in remembering, in preserving. We must ask, what will we leave behind? What legacy will outlast us? Will it be plastic in the oceans, or knowledge encoded with care? Will our myths speak of truth? Will our ruins whisper wisdom? And beyond legacy, there is meaning. Knowing that we are not the beginning allows us to feel connection not only with those who will come after, but with those who came before. We may never know their names. We may never read their texts, but we carry their fire, their curiosity, their courage, their questions. We, too, wonder. We, too, reach. We, too, make meaning from silence. This continuity gives us something precious, perspective. It softens our arrogance. It reminds us that the earth does not belong to us, and time does not center us. Civilizations are not eternal. They are waves, patterns, breaths of complexity that emerge and fade. What matters is not how long we endure, but how well we live while we are here. What we learn, what we share, what we protect. There is also comfort in knowing we are not the first to face uncertainty. Our ancestors faced ice ages, rising seas, famine, disease, war. They survived not because they were perfect, but because they were resilient, because they remembered, because they adapted. In every generation, someone has stood at the edge of the unknown and chosen to build anyway, chosen to teach, to care, to create. We are their legacy, and someday someone may be ours. Let us not underestimate the power of continuity. A story shared from one generation to the next can outlast empires. A lesson taught to a child can ripple across centuries. Even a fragment, a carved stone, a buried tool, a myth whispered in a forgotten dialect can be the bridge that connects ages. We build monuments to last. But perhaps the true monument is memory living, breathing, passed hand to hand. What we choose to preserve now may become the foundation for someone else's beginning. A book placed carefully in a protected archive. A language kept alive in song. A piece of land restored and tended. A scientific insight written in a form that endures. These are seeds, not endings. The light we kindle today may be the sunrise for another world we will never see. Perhaps this is the true gift of asking. What if human history began 100 pes, 000 years earlier than we think? It is not about rewriting textbooks. It is about reawakening our sense of wonder. It is about embracing uncertainty not as a void, but as a space for discovery. It is about realizing that we are not alone in our greatness or in our fragility. We are part of a longer sunrise, a longer unfolding. We did not light the first fire, nor will we kindle the last. But for now, we hold the flame. And that matters. We are a bridge between the deep past and the unknown future. What we carry forward may one day be the ember from which the next wave begins again. So let us walk gently. Let us build with care. Let us listen to the silence beneath our feet and the myths that hum in our blood. Let us study the shadows, the stars, the stories, not to prove what was, but to imagine what might have been and what might still be. Because the truth is not just that history is older than we think. The truth is that we are older than we think. Our memory reaches further than our records. Our story stretches beyond our sight. We are not the first. We are not the last. We are a moment in a great unfolding, a breath between waves, a light rising over forgotten lands, and that, in itself, is beautiful.